So what I'm going to talk about this morning is about how Christianity has totally impacted everything in the Western culture. And this has so profoundly affected our culture that we no longer really are aware of how it's been impacted. It is, as the title of the book that I'm kind of drawing from, The Air We Breathe. It is just the milieu in which we live and move, and so we don't think about it. Just like we don't think, oh, wow, that air is really great today. Well, we might think, that's fresh air. I remember some friends coming from California, and they said they were a little nervous about living in Dallas because they weren't sure they could trust air they couldn't see. Anyway, the book that I'm drawing from is called The Air We Breathe. It's written by Glen Scrivener. It's great content. I got both the Kindle version and the Audible version. If you like to listen to books, this guy is an Anglican minister from Australia. So it is just a great listen. The guy is just great. Wanted to start off with a quote. This may seem a little ironic, starting this whole section off with a quote from a non-Christian, Jordan Peterson. Some of you may know him. I know a lot of people don't like Jordan Peterson. He's a psychologist, so he's got to be wrong, is the way some of my acquaintances have put it. I don't understand that. But what he says here is profound. He says, I have got the choice of believing two impossible things. I can either believe that the world is constituted so that God took flesh, was crucified, and rose three days later, or I can believe that human beings invented this unbelievably preposterous story that has stretched into every atom of culture. I want to emphasize that, stretched into every atom of culture. And it isn't obvious to me that the second hypothesis is any easier to believe than the first. Because the more you investigate the manifestation of the story of Christ, the more insanely complicated and far-reaching it becomes. And now just think about that for a minute. Everything, every area of our culture, every interaction with a human being, our legal systems, everything, our churches, obviously our churches, but our schools, institutions of government, just the way we think. So what I want to do is I want to start out, and this comes, actually the material that I have here comes from throughout the book, but he starts the book by talking about the night before Christmas. I thought that was an elegant way to kind of couch what was the world like before Jesus arrived on the scene. And so let's start with origins. Does anybody here happen to know the Greek mythology around origins? Anybody know? Yeah, so it started with chaos, which was basically a nothing, and then Gaia came out of chaos. Gaia was the earth, and she was able to spontaneously give birth to the sky. That's Uranus. And then they had kids together. So the kids that they had were Titans. So one of the Titans decided to kind of head up the gods. His name was Kronos, the god of time. And since there were no other beings to marry, he married one of his sisters. But he was scared of any being that that came from them would overtake him. What he was literally afraid of is that they would chop him up, and throw him into the abyss. So every time they had a kid, he ate the kid. And or swallowed the kid would be a better way to put it. So this went on until Rhea, his sister wife, had Zeus. She hid Zeus from him, and then when Zeus was mature, he gave his dad a drink that caused him to throw up all his brothers and sisters who were intact. And then they attacked all the gods, all the titans, and threw them into the abyss and locked them in there. Wow. Now that is so close to Christian story of origin. Right? It's no. It's not even remotely close. So he says, Glen Scrivener says, here's what's in their origins: chaos, violence, death. This is the case wherever you turn in the ancient world. The Romans adopted much of the Greek mythology, performing more of a rebrand than a rewrite. Zeus was now Jupiter, Aphrodite was now Venus, Poseidon was Neptune, but the stories contain the same themes of jealousies, intrigues, and brutalities. Okay? So now think about how we are impacted by what we feel is ultimately real, right? Origin stories is really about what is ultimately real and how did it arrive? How did it get here? Okay? Would you be a little twisted if this was your ultimate view of reality? And I think the answer is yes. Worldview. Now this is really fascinating, and it's also extremely important to understand where they're coming from. And you'll see this as it kind of unfolds, the transformational benefits that we enjoy today. For them, the heavens were where the more perfect things existed. Earth, being at the bottom, was the sump of the cosmos. Okay? So what that is, and so we see this, some of the things that Jim talked about with Gnosticism, right? It's like material things, those are evil and bad. How do we know? Well, because the proverbial blankety blank runs downhill, right? So it all ends up on earth. Now, most people thought of a geocentric view of the cosmos was a Christian thing, a naive, egocentrical thing. No. This came from the classic cultures before Christ. Now, when the material things were evil, ethereal things that as you move up into the heavens, those were pure, those were righteous, those were good. Now, this led to some really interesting conclusions. A central feature of the ancient Greek worldview was the idea of fate and necessity. Aristotle saw all things unfolding by an all-determining reason. Neither the gods, nor humanity, nor the world were free. Now let's make sure we don't miss that. Neither the gods are not free. It's all fate and destiny. Everything was the way it had to be. So on a question like what shape are the orbits of the planets, Aristotle would answer circular, because the circle is the most perfect shape. And in all the cosmos, heavenly bodies are the closest to perfection. Notice the assumptions. There's a way things must be that is baked into the fabric of the cosmos. The orbits of the planet are fixed by reason. We can assess reason by thinking carefully. Investigating the world with our senses is not that reliable. After all, our senses can deceive us. For Aristotle and his followers, studying the world was less a journey outwards into the surprising way things are, and more of a journey of the mind upwards into the predictable way things must be. All this made the Greeks brilliant at reasoning and indifferent to experimentation. Now, how different is that from the way we operate today? Most of the people in this room are not scientists. But, if you're baking a cake and you think, I did it this way and it was just so dry, I'm going to try it this way the next time. What are we doing? We're doing experimentation. It's not just all of these ingredients when they go together. It's just, okay, those ingredients in that oven, it doesn't work. Yeah. Anyway, we are, experimentation is baked into the way we think now. The sanctity of human life. Plato thought that in order to be worth rearing, children must be malleable, disposed to virtue, and physically fit. If they did not prove themselves worthy, the parents would properly dispose of them in secret, so that no one will know what has become of them. Aristotle thought defective children should be exposed, that is, discarded at rubbish heaps, abandoned on hillsides, thrown down wells, drowned in rivers. As to exposing or rearing the children born, let there be a law that no deformed child shall be reared. In other words, it would be immoral not to do this. Infanticide was so widespread in the Roman world, in fact in all the world, that the first known treatise on gynecology included the vital section, How to Recognize the Newborn That is Worth Rearing. That's a punch in the gut, right? And yet, this was standard. This was just standard for them. So let's move to equality. For that some should rule and that others should be ruled is a thing not only necessary but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. Better hope you're in the right camp. That was Aristotle, by the way. Glen Scrivener told a story or related a historical event about a slave that had killed his master. It turns out that the Roman law is if a slave kills his masters, all the slaves in that household must be killed. So this particular guy had a lot of slaves, 400 slaves, 400 women and children and men and women and children. And they put up 400 crosses, and they crucified every single one of them. To see the slaves' punishment inflicted publicly on sometimes hundreds of unwashed masses, even innocents, was to see their worthlessness in the starkest terms. The powers that be killed those people because they could, and the more they butchered them, the more they felt able to butcher them. As one victim of Roman brutality said, our torturers were commanded to think and act as if we no longer existed. To see someone crucified was to watch their unpersoning and to hear the message, do not go the way of that wretch. Yeah, anybody want to hop in a time machine? Go back to Rome? Well, at least I hear the food's good. Religion. Roman religion was different. They already had a son of God, the Emperor Caesar Augustus, who was called Lord, Savior of the world, and Son of God. The God whose son he was by adoption was Julius Caesar, whose claims to divinity included killing 1 million Gauls and enslaving 1 million more. That was Caesar's boast anyway, but whatever the true figure, we should note that it was considered a boast and not a blemish. Here was evidence of his greatness, indeed, of his godness. You know, once you understand the origin stories, you can see why they might say, see, yeah, I'm just like juice. I made my dad puke, and then we cut him up and threw all his siblings in the abyss. Sex. In the sexual life of the Roman Empire, it would be impossible to overstate the decisive influence of social position and the determination of sexual boundaries. It was the status of your partner, not their consent, their age, or their gender that mattered. It was your reputation within a shame-based culture that determined the righteousness of an encounter, not any inherent wrongfulness regarding particular acts. Okay, you kind of get that mentality, right? Yeah, it's like it's might makes right. You know, if I'm the king of the castle, I can do whatever I want to whoever I want, whenever I want, and I don't have to explain myself. In the ancient world, sex with boys and girls was not merely tolerated, it was celebrated by writers like Juvenal, Petronius, Horace, Strato, Lucian, and Philostratus. The word they used was pederasty. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Love of children. Okay? So this is the world that existed before Christ came along, right? So when people tell us that, Christianity is old, it's out of date, it just doesn't apply to our world anymore, well, it transformed that world. That's the reality that Christ was born into. So let's talk about equality. There's a couple of things that just blew the ancient world's mind. One of those is to say that all human beings are created in the image of God. That just blew their mind. You might get away with saying a Caesar was God, but you wouldn't say that anybody was created in the image of God. The other thing that the Bible talks about is the fact that God gave us dominion, right? All of us were created to rule this world. None of us were created to rule one another. He talks about a case during COVID where a retired barrister named Lord Sumption made a comment that I don't accept that all lives are of equal value. And there was a firestorm. The people just exploded in anger. And they finally had kind of a talk show, kind of a environment where he was able to explain himself. And what he explained started to make a little bit more sense. He said, look, we only have limited resources. I am not saying the moral worth of some individuals is worth less than the moral worth of other individuals. I'm saying that if you only have the resources to treat one person, and one person is 98 and the other person is 9, you're going to pick the 9-year-old, right? The 98-year-old has lived the majority of their lives, and so you're going to invest those resources in somebody who will benefit from that. Well, that's a very, very different story or concept that's communicated than what he initially said. But Glen Scrivener imagines, what if you could bring Plato into that talk show and say, let's have Plato comment on this particular thing. So it's trivially obvious to the father of Western philosophy that lives are of unequal value. Some are men, some are women, some are Greeks, some are barbarians, some are free, and some are slaves. There are rich and poor, wise and foolish, strong and weak. All that we see in nature is difference. Compare any two people concerning any one attribute, and what will you conclude? This one has more than that one. This one, of course, is the definition of unequal. To insist that two people are equal really, when every human trait that betrays inequality raises the question, equal how? Where is this magical realm where your equality exists? Can you show it to me? If Plato was being polite, he might say, your faith in equality fascinates me, and I'd like to be able to see what you see. Clearly, equality is very important to you. You live your life in the light of this belief, and I can respect that. But to me, it looks as if you've decided to believe in something with no reason or evidence. I am not convinced. Now think about that for a minute. The concept of equality today is virtually universal. Is there any real reason outside of being created in the image of God, being bought and paid for with the life and death of Jesus Christ, to warrant that view? That perspective of the ancient world looking at our world throws into contrast the amount of transformation that Christianity had on the world we live in today, right? It just blows me away when I think about it. Let's talk about compassion. That's chapter 3. In the Gospels, the biographies of Christ's life, the word that describes Jesus' emotional life more than any other is compassion. The authors had to reach for an odd Greek word to describe this depth of feeling, a verb form for intestines. When describing love, we moderns speak romantically of the heart, but the ancient people knew that the deepest feelings are experienced in our innards. So his subtitle for this chapter was gut-wrenching love. I will tell you though, if you really see just a horrific case of abuse, it doesn't hit me in the heart. It does hit me in the gut. You hear that, man, that was a gut punch. Yeah, that's where this comes from. That's where this compassion. So how did Christianity, leveraging this very unique perspective on the world of compassion, of love, of gut-wrenching love for those around them, transform our world? So we see that in a lot of different ways. We see that in medical care and the establishment of hospitals. David Bentley Hart gives this sketch of the early development. St. Ephraim the Syrian, when the city of Edessa was ravaged by plague, established hospitals open to all who were afflicted. St. Basil the Great founded a hospital in Cappadocia with a ward set aside for the care of lepers, whom he did not disdain to nurse with his own hands. St. Benedict of Nursia opened a free infirmary at Monte Cassino and made care of the sick a paramount duty of his monks. In Rome, the Christian noblewoman and scholar St. Fabiola established the first public hospital in Western Europe, and despite her wealth and position, often ventured out into the streets personally to seek out those who needed care. St. John Chrysostom, while Patriarch of Constantinople, used his influence to fund several such institutions in the city. I find it absolutely fascinating that when you look at the name of hospitals, that's changing now, but until very recently, it was Methodist Memorial, Texas Presbyterian, Baylor. Just the fact that these institutions were named after different denominations, right? That should have been kind of an indication that there's something going on here. Going back to the night before Christmas, that you can see how the stark contrast between the way people thought, oh, those guys are slaves. Yeah, they did have medical care, by the way. Maybe just to make sure that I put a little bit of counterpoint here. But anybody want to guess who it was for? It was for the rich, and it was for the military, right? They had a vested interest in keeping, just like we want to keep the star players in the game in professional sports. They wanted the star warriors able and ready to go at a moment's notice. Suppression of gladiatorial games is another thing that we see by compassion. And this is one of the most amazing stories. Emperor Honorius was moved, so it was said, by the efforts of a monk named Telemachus, who entered the arena one day with the goal of stopping the slaughter. The monk stood between the gladiators, but was stoned to death by the angry crowd. There is power, though, in sacrifice, power to overturn fear and violence. As his example sank in with the masses, as his story reached the ears of the emperor, so there came a revolution. As with the Lord whom he followed, Telemachus' bloodshed was turned into a blessing. His sacrifice changed hearts. His death made peace, and his martyrdom proved victorious. And just imagine, he had no thought for himself when he ran into the arena and he was shouting, for God's sake, stop, stop. This is an abomination. I don't know if these are the actual words, but certainly this is what's going through his heart and his mind. And we've all seen fans acting bad You get a bunch of fans together and they can be the most awful people on the planet. But they're not impervious. And as that sacrificial act sank in, they all started to become ashamed of themselves. It hit the emperor, and the emperor was like, yeah. Yeah, and you think about it, this made a lot of money for a lot of people. These were things that were really hard to pry out of culture because it was so ingrained and because the money was just tied up into this. Another element of transformation caused by the compassion showed by the church was the end of infant exposure. In the late 4th century, the Christian Emperor Valentinian I made it a law that parents rear their own children, and he forbade the killing of an infant. But culturally, what made the enduring differences was not the changes in the law, but the changes in hearts. A new kind of heroism had gripped the world. It was evident in monks like Telemachus or nuns like Macrina, whose life of radical generosity, including touring the rubbish dumps to rescue exposed infants and adopting them into her community. I heard at one point that this exposure led to a mismatch of females and males because everybody wanted a male son to continue on the family line. There were lots of girls that were just like, we don't need a girl. Yeah, what we need is a son. Same thing happened in China. In China now, there are lots of guys and not a lot of girls, because if we can only have one kid, where it's going to be a boy, and then nobody really thought down the road, who are they going to marry? Yeah, bless their hearts. Yeah. So the interesting thing that I heard, and this is not something I studied, and I don't have a reference for it, but I heard that one of the ways that Christianity made great strides forward is when it came time for men to marry, the baby girls had been rescued from exposure, raised in Christian homes. There were a lot of marriages with Christian women. And that over time, that influence, everybody knows the influence of a woman. Consent. Christianity invented the category of sexual abuse. Okay? Prior to Christianity, that was not even a thing. Kyle Harper writes of the Roman world, the complete violent exploitation of women without any claim to civic protection was simply, as a problem in its own right, invisible. Right? So Jesus initiated the first sexual revolution, and this is just mind-blowing when you think about it. Kind of prepare your minds to absorb this. If the revolution of the 20th century said women can be as free as men, the Jesus revolution had said men must be as restricted as women. Think about the way that the Romans looked at women. Now it's interesting, they had a concept of chastity, so to speak, among men. But basically what that meant is you don't go mess around with somebody else's wife. And that usually was more of a statement of power. I can take your things and you can't do anything about it, than it was passion. So basically what it was like, don't go messing up the order of society. That's why there's brothels. That's why there's temple prostitutes. So a man who visited the brothels was actually exercising chastity. That was channeling his lusts in a culturally acceptable way. For men to voluntarily restrict themselves to a single woman, that was non sequitur to the Romans. Jesus says that those who do not embrace marriage can instead embrace this other calling. They can forsake sex altogether and serve undistractedly in the kingdom of God. Those are the options: lifelong monogamy or chaste singleness. There's no third option. Yeah. Now, obviously, marriage is in shambles today, but you just still see the movies primarily are still looking to, everybody needs to find that ideal person. And that idea that if you find that right person, you can live a life that's just really solid and well-rounded and fulfilling and all those kinds of things. Where did that come from? That concept just didn't exist. Roman men had wives to produce heirs and mistresses to fool around with, right? But he didn't give any of those gals, any thoughts, any second thoughts. It's like, there we go. Okay. Enlightenment. Education. So the whole story of Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire, was really fascinating. So he came on the scene, and I know we've talked about it in class. He came on the scene, and he was a go-getter. You know, he got his armies. He went out and conquered people. He actually, I think he crowned himself as Augustus. You know, so he was looking back at the Caesars for, kind of a pattern to follow. And when he would conquer an army, he would force the conversion of the prisoners into Christianity. A priest named Alcuin wrote him and told him that this was completely and totally unbiblical and that he needed to stop. And so, what did Charlemagne did? Just like the Caesars, he had him executed? No, that's not what he did. Charlemagne was carrying on his imperial mission in the customary way, and the body count was mounting. But incredibly, by the end of the 780s, Alcuin, the scholar and priest, had changed the mind of Charlemagne, the warlord. He persuaded him about persuasion. Charlemagne backtracked on his forced conversions policy and never wanted to do anything by halves, threw himself into a new venture. The man who would be crowned Augustus became an educationalist. So in 789, Charlemagne established major educational reforms which proved to be the beginning of what's called the Carolingian Renaissance. Over 70 schools were established. These taught the liberal arts, a foundation of grammar, logic, rhetoric, followed by arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. From there, some could opt for medicine or law or theology, but notice the breadth of learning expected at the outset. Notice, too, the sources of such learning. They were not limited to Scripture or even to Christian authors. They included Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Pliny the Elder, Horace, etc., etc., etc. I'm just looking at the clock. Now, does this sound like the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, where ignorance reigned, where it was a desert for 1,000 years?
Modern historians have eliminated the idea of the Dark Ages.
Yeah, they have.
That word is not used.
Yeah, although it still comes up. And that's part of it. It's like not only was it not dark, Christianity was in transforming things. So from a technology perspective, wind and water power, sail technology, selective plant breeding, the heavy plow, transformational for agriculture, eyeglasses, architecture and construction. Think about Notre Dame. Anybody, if you haven't been there personally, you've seen pictures of it, flying buttresses. I mean, these were complex engineering things. Notre Dame, they started like around 1100 AD. That was right in the middle of the not-so-dark ages. That's what we'll call it now. Pipe organs, mechanical clocks. Now we have all these digital clocks, and we don't see it, but if you ever look into a mechanical clock, those were very complicated. Yeah. Human rights. Augustine planted the concept, and it attained a spectacular bloom in the 11th and 12th centuries. These particular centuries are important, but often overlooked flowering in history. They are sometimes called the Gregorian reforms after Pope Gregory. Others speak of the papal revolution, since there were multiple popes who carried forward what Gregory dubbed his Reformation. During this period, the legal rulings of church courts were being compiled and analyzed, taking the assumptions of the faith, notions like equality, charity, marriage, and much more, and codifying them as church laws. Where do our laws come from? Our modern-day laws reflect these, the efforts that were hammered out in the not-so-dark ages. Parliaments, the first concept of limiting the power of kings came in the 1200s. Okay? This was very enlightened, and certainly long time before, hundreds of years before the actual enlightening. Science. By the way, there's other books out here about this transformational aspect. I kind of got into this one because I'd been reading some that focused primarily on science, because I am a bona fide geek. But the content about science in this book is really, really solid. But there are other ones like there if you want to go deep on that particular subject. So the Christian foundation for science. God created according to his pleasure. Now you stop and think about it. In the Greek view, things were the way they were because they had to be, right? They had to be that way. And they had this transcendence from, the crappy stuff below our feet, which is where everything drains, to the ethereal kind of perfection that was up in the heavens. So we as Christians recognize that God created a universe according to his pleasure. We don't know ahead of time how they should be. We have to go follow that. God equipped humanity to understand his creation. That's the other very unique perspective that Christianity added to science. It's sometimes called the intelligibility or comprehensibility of the universe. Einstein called that a miracle. He said the miracle that first of all, that the world could be understood. That's one part of the miracle. The other part is that we are capable of understanding that. That don't let this slip by unnoticed. No other perspective in all of history brought that to science. That's the only reason science could have started, is because of this Christian perspective. The founders of science all responded to this, not just Einstein. Copernicus, to know the mighty works of God, to comprehend the wonderful workings of his law. Surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable model of worship to the Most High. Let's see. I'm going to skip over some of this. There's so much good stuff. Let's talk about freedom. Let's talk about slavery. We have such a blight in American history from that. And truthfully, most people that aren't Christians blame Christianity for that. But let's go back and let's get the true story. There were true rounds of slavery. The first round of slavery was the slavery system that existed when Jesus came on the scene. So I'm just calling it end of slavery, round one. After Rome fell in 410, slavery in those western territories began dissolving away. Soon after the 9th century, slavery had all but vanished from northern Europe. By the 11th century, it had virtually gone from central Italy and France. By 1200, it had largely disappeared in England. Here's yet another surprising development during the Middle Ages. Okay, so slavery is gone. Christianity has triumphed. We have transformed society. So what happened? Anybody hazard a guess? Well, not Africa, actually America. So Columbus discovered America. And all of a sudden, it was like, it was like the gold rush in America, except this was a colonization rush. New empires to be had. And so the relapse occurred as a result of Columbus discovering the Americas. And so everybody, and I'll just read this quote real quick. No people in antiquity would ever have succeeded in winning an empire for themselves had they doubted their license to slaughter and enslave the vanquished. But Christians could not do so readily. They couldn't be innocent in their cruelty. When scholars in Europe sought to justify the Spanish conquest of the New World, they reached not for the church fathers, but for Aristotle. As the philosopher Aristotle says, it is clear that some men are slaves by nature and others are free by nature. This is the justification for slavery that came up. It wasn't Christianity. Now, they had some hardcore marketing going on. People read through the scriptures. They didn't understand the slavery, quote unquote, slavery system that's described in the Bible. They didn't understand, by the way, that the Bible describes a lot of things that weren't ideal. So they would take those things to be normative. Like we can continue to, it's okay for us to continue to do those things today. There was a lot of things that they just did not do well in terms of understanding what Scripture is really saying. So they used that to justify the ongoing practice of slavery. Now the rebound came when Christians finally, I don't know about you, sometimes you're hearing stuff and you're thinking, okay, that doesn't sound right. I can't put my finger on it, and this sounds right. And eventually, suddenly, it crystallizes. When it crystallized for people, people just started coming out of the woodworks against slavery, and that became the abolition movement. William Wilberforce was one of the foremost pioneers of that. And then, so if you guys haven't seen Amazing Grace, the movie, you got to see that. It's mind-blowing. But after the most vigorous moral campaigning Britain had ever seen, including unprecedentedly large petitions, rallies, boycotts, pamphlets, sermons, and speeches, the abolition of the trade came in 1804, followed by the emancipation of slaves in 1833. Now, here's something that I think that is really important to understand. Christianity had really pulled off this amazing transformation, but to get everybody aligned, they had to kind of tamp it down a little bit. There's a phrase in here I want you to look for that you've heard, and this is where it came from. It was here in this political phase that the unashamedly Christian distinctives of the abolitionists began to be muted. For abolition to spread from Protestant Britain to Catholic and Muslim lands, there needed to be a work of translation. Diplomacy required that the language be altered. In 1842, a new phrase was coined. Slavery, said the lawyers, was a crime, not against the Creator, not against Christ, but a crime against humanity. Now, it turned out to be efficacious in terms of to be able to get everybody to kind of play from the same, sing from the same hymnal, so to speak. But it's a step back. And this is what you see constantly throughout the history of the Middle Ages. The church would have a transformative effect. People would suddenly see this is really the right way to do it. This is the good way to do it. Now that we see that, though, we don't really so much need God, right? So there was a pattern that consistently went. It went with science, deeply religious scientists would uncover the way the world worked, the way God had designed the work, and as soon as people knew how the world worked, we said, well, let's just kind of leave the religious stuff off to the side. Just to show you how that transpires as we move on, let's look at the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, we've heard this a lot. But when you take a step back historically, you see this from a very different light. To imagine that human rights and equality are self-evident is audacious to say the least. Self-evident things are like triangles have three sides, and all bachelors are unmarried. They should be things you can't know. But outside of a biblical foundation, no one in history, thinkers and moralists, has known about human rights. No one has seen in humans an inherent dignity and value simply by virtue of their being members of the human race. A survey of human civilization reveals that the only self-evident thing about human rights is that they are not self-evident. So the reason I wanted to put that in there as we close is just to let you know that we live in a world where people are assuming these things of morality, equality, the value of people, science, and they are rejecting and denying the truth of God that allowed us to reach this state. There are debates when, like when Jordan Peterson is in discussions with people, and he starts talking about like the quotes that I put at the very beginning. People start saying, no, you are smuggling Jesus into this conversation. And the reality is, those guys are also smuggling Jesus into the conversation. Everybody is smuggling Jesus into all the conversations, and they don't even realize it. So I think that this is really a good investment if you guys want to go get that book. When you talk to friends, neighbors, colleagues, and the subject comes up about how backwards Christians are, how out of touch they are with history, it's like this would be a great opportunity to say, well, it's interesting that you say that.